Hi everyone. I welcome you all to the new courses of cellular microenvironment from oxygen gradient to gene expression. So in this series, we'll explore how cells interact with their surroundings microenvironment and how oxygen, nutrients, and molecular signaling regulate cellular behavior. So beginning with the fundamental of the cellular microenvironment, we will progressively build an understanding of oxygen diffusion, hypoxia, hip signaling, gene expression, and molecular biology techniques that is used to investigate these kind of processes. So finally, these concepts will be, connected to the modern biomedical research, cancer biology, tissue engineering, and 3D cell culture system. So before going to the topic, first we should understand who are going to get benefited from this course. So as I have told you, I have designed this completely new courses for undergraduate student who are studying biology, biotechnology, biochemistry, pharmacy, life science, and this course will also benefit will also give benefit to the master's student or MSc student who are seeking a strong conceptual understanding of molecular and cellular biology. This course will also helpful for the PhD scholar working in cancer biology, tissue engineering, biomaterials, regenerative medicine, and the molecular biology related research field. And this will also be helpful for research and laboratory professional who is interested in understanding hypoxia, gene expression analysis, and three-dimensional cell culture techniques. So by the end of this lecture, you will understand how the cellular microenvironment regulates cell behavior, how oxygen and the nutrient gradient influences gene expression, how cell adapt hypoxia through hip signaling pathways, and how these molecular mechanisms are investigated, using modern experimental techniques. So the ultimate goal is to, from understanding a single cell to understand how, disease like cancer evolve through change in the cellular microenvironment. Okay. So first, I'll start with the cellular microenvironment. This is one of the most important thing to understand before we go in the deeper of the this course. So when we talk about the biology, it's not only a studying of the cell. It is the study of how cells interact with their surrounding, and we should know these things. What is the surrounding? So before we start about the cellular microenvironment, let me ask you a very fundamental question. Imagine we planted two identical mango seeds. One seed is planted in a fertile soil where it receives plenty of water, nutrients, sunlight, and another metabolite sources that is responsible for giving growth to the cell seeds or tree, and another other seed is planted in a dry weather, rocky soil where water is scarce and the environmental condition is harsh compared to the previous one. So both seed contain same genetic information. Now think for a moment, what happens? Will both of these seeds grow or grow into identical plants? And most of us would answer immediately that no. And the reason is very simple because the difference is not the seed itself, right? But it is the environment surrounding the seeds. In the first case, the environment is very suitable for growth of the seeds or growth of the plant. That's why it will grow much better than the second one. And interestingly, what we see, the same principle applies to the cells in our body as well. So every cell carries almost the same DNA. Yet cells do not. All of these cells do not behave in the same way. Some cells divide rapidly, uh, some cells, remain inactive, some migrate, while other may even die. And the reason behind these different behavior is that every cells live in own unique, local environment. And this immediately, so we can define that the immediate environment surrounding a cell, which is called as the cellular environment, right? And that is called the world around the cells. So if we see the cellular environment that contains various component like oxygen, nutrients that contains glucose and amino acid, then growth factors and signaling molecules, then extracellular matrix, neighboring cells, pH and another chemical factors, blood vasculatures, and the mechanical forces. So we'll study all of these components one by one in detail, but all of these components are very important. So in today's lecture, we will explore what the cellular microenvironment, obviously I have told you the definition, and all about all of these components of the cellular microenvironment. Is that clear? And then we will understand also that why this is important for fields such as cancer biology, tissue engineering, or regenerative medicine and biomedical research. So by the end of this lecture, you will appreciate that to truly understand how a cell behave, we must first understand the world in which the cell lives. So let's start with the first component, that is oxygen. So when we see the oxygen, that is very essential for the cellular respiration and ATP production. So when there is a low oxygen condition, that is called as the hypoxia. I'll discuss this hypoxia in the latest lecture in a very detailed way. So hypoxia basically alters cell function and activates the survival pathway. So if you see that this is very dynamic, it will change, right? So in the next slide, you will see the cellular microenvironment is dynamic in nature, and why it is dynamic in nature, we'll explain you in the very detail. Then comes to the another component that is also very important, that is nutrients. Nutrients basically provides energy and it serves as a building blocks. So let's say glucose is the primary energy sources for the most of the cells. Third one is the extracellular matrix. It is another very important, component of the cellular microenvironment because that provides the structural support and, biochemical signaling. So it is like a soil, like soil for the cells. Like if a soil is good or if it provides a good structural support to the root of the tree, then the tree will grow well, something like that. So this is how these things, this extracellular matrix is. Then there comes neighboring cell. Obviously, we know that cells communicate with each other, like immune cell, fibroblast, cancer cell, endothelial cell, all of these things that influences the cell behavior. Then there comes the signaling molecules. So signaling molecules, we'll study these things in very detail in the subsequent lecture. And this is very important part about this coursework actually. So if you see the hormones, growth factors, cytokines, and other molecules that act as a chemical messenger. Then there comes a mechanical force because as we know in our body, there are fluid flows like blood is flowing, then there is intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, lots of fluids are there and the flow is happening. So all of these, fluid creates some or, produces some kind of, shear stress, pressure or a stretching of the cell, something like that. So this cells can sense all and respond to all of these mechanical cues. Then there comes a pH and another chemical factor. Since with time, what happens? Cell metabolism is happening in our cells. So lots of cellular biological machineries are there that do some kind of metabolism, right? And due to this particular region, some waste, product is getting accumulated. That will change the pH of the cellular microenvironment. Is that clear? So till now, we understood all of the component of the cellular microenvironment and why this is important. Now, next, coming to the next part of these things, the cellular microenvironment is dynamic in nature. And why it is dynamic in nature, we'll answer these things right now. So, if we do some exercise, what happens at that time, our body demand oxygen in more amount, right? So, you will see in our body oxygen concentration is changing. Then there comes after eating, what you will see that glucose level increases. So now glucose is another part of cellular microenvironment. So you can see that glucose level is changing, oxygen demand is increasing. Then there comes a injury. During injury, what happens? You want immune cell, and as I have told you, immune cell is one of the important component for the cellular microenvironment. Then there comes during cancer, you will see in subsequent lecture that oxygen becomes limited and that condition is called the hypoxia, right? So if you see here that these are the component of the cellular microenvironment and these are changing, right, with time. So that's why we can say that the cellular microenvironment is dynamic in nature because this changes with time or with the requirement in our body. Now, Another interesting thing that we'll see here is in our body, we have various tissues like muscles tissue, nerves tissue, liver cells, and skin in liver tissue, in skin tissue. And all of these tissue contents made up of billions of the respective cells, like muscle tissue would be made up of muscle cells, then nerve cells, then liver cells, and skin cells respectively, that based on the tissue. So now, when we talk about the muscle cells, so muscle cells expresses gene when it there is a requirement of muscles expansion and contraction. So only that time this cells expresses that kind of gene. Then there comes the nerve cells. Nerve cells expresses gene when there is electrical requirement of electrical signaling. Then there comes the third one is a liver cell that expresses gene that is involved in metabolism and detoxification. Then there comes a skin cells that will express gene when there is a requirement of barrier protection and repair. So if you see all of these cells that is involved in all of these tissue that have same genetic information, that means they have same DNA, right? But their surrounding makes them to, work differently. So all of these cells are having same DNA, but they are not, showing the same gene expression. They are showing the different gene expression for the requirement, right? For the different work. And why this is happening? Because of the surrounding, because of the cellular microenvironment, right? So now you would have understood why cellular microenvironment is important, and if it is changing, then what kind of outcomes can come in a biological way. Now, next thing is that what happens if a cellular microenvironment changes? It's very important because till now we get to know that there is a cellular microenvironment, there are some components of the cellular microenvironment, and that is not static, that is dynamic in nature, that is changing. Now, here we will understand what happens if it will change, right? This is the output. So, let's say if any cells, if there is a change in environment, like let's say low oxygen, then what will happen? The cells will detect these changes, right? And once it will detect, then what will happen? It will give the signal to the gene, and then gene expression occurs. So in next lecture or subsequent lecture, I'll discuss how gene expression occurs, what is gene expression, all these things in details. We'll study these things in very detail. Then what happens? Due to this gene expression, cellular behavior will change, and then it will ultimately cause a disease if it is related to that. Right. So ultimately, you can see if there is a small change in the cellular microenvironment, it will ultimately lead to a disease in our body. So in the next lecture, this is all about what is cellular microenvironment, what are the components of the cellular microenvironment, why cellular microenvironment is dynamic in nature, and what happens if cellular microenvironment changes. Now, in the next lecture, we will explore one of the most important, component of the cellular microenvironment, and also we will see how change in microenvironment creates the oxygen gradient, right? And this is very important to understand, especially for a disease like cancer. Okay, so I'll stop this lecture here. See you in the next lecture.